All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to week two of the PISM American Founding course. In this week, we're going to leave the intro and we're going to start talking about colonial settlement of British America and a little bit of pre-colonial America and kind of the regional economies that made up America at this time. To lead this first session this week, we have Fernando Arteaga, who is the academic director of the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets here at UPenn, and he is also a senior fellow in the Department of Economics here at the University of Pennsylvania. His research is economic history, institutional economics, and development economics. And yeah, just start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Patrick. So let's see if I can share my screen. So can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start. So this week we will continue what we were discussing the previous weeks. So the previous week was the introduction, and we had our guest lecturer Sean Gailmar talking a little bit about colonial settlement, and we will continue discussing large aspects of colonial aspects before the independence, before the American Revolution. So before doing that, however, let me give you a brief overview of what we are going to talk today. So the first lecture, again, there are these several themes in terms of how we move from initial conditions to set of political institutions, to set of allocations, to set of welfare effects. This lecture will be divided in three parts. The first part will be talking a little bit about what was occurring prior to the arrival of Europeans. So this is sometimes a neglected topic when we study the story of the United States. But even though we will not devote it as much time as we would like to, it's still nonetheless a quite relevant aspect that we need to discuss. And this is relevant because sometimes we forget that this was not a tabula rasa. So there was not a clean slate here by which just the Europeans arrived and they constructed everything out of that. They had to deal and contend with the set of initial geography and endowments that had existed here, and also with the set of Native Americans that had already kind of changed the environment in very large ways. And so, how they actually dealt with each other is super important in order to understand the way in which the colonial settlement occurred and the way in which the American Revolution actually happened. So that's a very big aspect. Then the second aspect that we will also talk a little bit is in terms not just of the colonials that moved and migrated into North America, but also contend that it is very, very important to discuss what was occurring in England at the time. So if we had more time, we will not just discuss England, but we'll discuss England in context of the whole European context. So France and Spain, of course, are other competing empires that also have its own territories in the Americas. We don't have time to cover that, unfortunately, but we will discuss a little bit of English history because, again, without understanding what was the incentive for the initial settlers to initially move towards North America, we really cannot understand what was occurring here in the very first place. And as Sean Gilmart already kind of acknowledged, it is important to stress that a lot of the procedures and constitutional framework that the initial settlers follow came directly from this British institutional background. And then we will end up with a brief overview of the economic overview, an overview of the economies in North America. We will discuss if there was a market. I kind of already tell you that there was not a unified market. There were different regional economies that actually were unified across an imperial network that, of course, had the center in England, in London, but specifically North America was connected, very much connected to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is often neglected when we discuss American economic history, but it is very important to stress that the survival and relevance of the of the of North American colonies very much hinge on how well they adapted to export goods to the Caribbean colonies. And the Caribbean colonies were kind of the most important node in the Americas for the British imperial policies. And so that's kind of the brief overview that we're going to talk. Let's move on. And let's start by discussing specifically the pre-Columbian aspects, right? So, Native America is super important precisely because of these 4 points 5 points that I'm highlighting here. The first one is that life before European arrival already tell us how relevant was geography and climate in terms of making some sort of societies adapt to it. So already, of course, the Native Americans had to adapt to the different places in which they inhabited. So we already have a contention that that's an example of how other human societies would also have to contend to. And second, and related to this, is that one of the most important characteristics of human societies all across the world is that we kind of shape the environment in which we live. That's kind of one of the definitory aspects of what makes us human and what makes a human society human in the very first place. So natives had already kind of changed a lot of the environment. There's a huge discussion here about how much they have changed. So for example, we already know, if you are an American, you know that there's this contention that the bison was overhunted at some time in the 19th century in US history. But we also know that even before the arrival of Europeans, major animals had already been overhunted, and agriculture itself had already molded a lot of what the forest looked like in North America. So natives had already changed quite a lot the landscape that then it is the context in which the English would come and arrive to. And this is also important to contend that when the English or the Europeans, we will not be talking a lot about the French, which are also relevant, but when the French and the English arrive, and also the Spanish in the south arrive, they had to contend with these Native American societies. And let me stress something that I think is super relevant, is that sometimes in our neglect of pre-Columbian societies at the time of the arrival of the Europeans, we tend to imagine life before Europeans as some sort of idyllic sort of state in which everybody kind of like each other and they all cooperated. And that was not true at all. So the same themes that we kind of discussed in the introduction in terms of social conflict, commitment issues, asymmetry of informations, those things still exist for all human societies, and so they also existed for these pre-Columbian societies. So we will do some sort of simplifications, of course, but in terms of understanding how the Europeans, when they arrived, they changed the relationships between Native Americans. Native Americans already had a lot of enmities between themselves. They had already their own societies, and there was a lot of coercive labor between each other, and there were conquests, and the Europeans more or less had to insert themselves into that setting. And so when we move into the fourth point here, is that the native polities are super important to understand the development of the colonial settlements, at least up until the times of the American Revolution. So just to point to one event that is of the utmost importance, that we will devote more time perhaps in the next week, is the French and Indian War that occurred in the mid of the 18th century. Why is it called the French-Indian War? Because from the perspective of the English, it was a war fought by the English against a major combination of French Europeans and their native allies. So the French, for example, follow a very different pattern of settlement. They of course, mostly focus on expansion in the north of what today is Montreal, well, the Quebec, historically the city of Quebec, but the area of Quebec. And they had a ring of forts that more or less surrounded a lot of English North America up to Louisiana, more or less. But unlike, say, for example, something that we will discuss in just a moment, is that the Puritans, for example, fled England because they had this contention against the English political setting as it had occurred in England in the 17th century. They contended the religious aspect. They were not content by the way in which the Anglican hierarchy was governed, and they wanted England to be more reformed than it was. So once they saw that reforming the English church was not possible, they just chose to leave and form one society of their own. So basically, that's what they did. So the same things occurred all across Europe. So the Reformation, kind of the one of the most important events in European history, occurred between the 16th century and early 17th century, depending on what your focus on, but basically transformed the religious context of the whole Western areas. And France was also besieged by these problems, and the Protestants also contended against the Catholic Church in France in this time. However, unlike the English, which allowed the Puritans to live and form a colony of their own, the French did not. So most of the French settlements were settled by Catholics and people loyal that were Catholic, and they were basically from a very different background compared to the Puritans that were allowed to free from England. That meant that created from the very beginning a differentiation between the French and English places in which they located and the pace at which they developed themselves. So, for example, one of the common aspects that we will discuss in just a moment, that actually a commonality in the English sphere is precisely that they had a demographic explosiveness that made them improve their demographic capacity in quite large rates. And that did not happen for the French, precisely because migration was quite constrained and also because the fertility rate was not as large. But how does that translate to the topic that we're discussing here in terms of natives? Is that if they were to survive, if the French were to survive in the environment in which there were a lot of natives and a lot of increasing amount of English settlers, they had to ally themselves with the Indians. So the set of incentives that they faced were very different compared to those of the British. And of course, that created the beginning of the French and Indian War. And after the war was won by England, it also kind of reflects natives also played a big role in the way in which the crown, the English crown, saw its own colonies. Because, and this will become super relevant when we approach more the time of the American Revolution, a very point of contention within the colonials and the people living in mainland England is that what are the benefits and the cost of governing the colonies with respect to England itself, right? And even though the war was won by the England, for England it was very costly, and it was a war mostly basically the budget of the war was mostly borne out by the English taxpayer living in England. And so there was an incentive by the crown not to experience any or to prevent at least some of these wars that anymore. So they did not want the natives to have more wars against the English colonials. The problem, of course, is that from the point of view or the perspective of the English colonials living in North America, the fact that they had won the war meant for them that they could actually move to the western lands and actually settle more lands to the west. But the issue is that the British Crown did not want to do that. They wanted to prevent that. And that created one of the initial and big points of contention between English themselves. And hence, this is just kind of a very broad summary, but it is relevant in order to understand that the natives played a big role in how both within English sphere it is super relevant. The natives are super relevant, and also in terms of the competition between the different European empires vis-a-vis or with respect to the natives. And hence we should not neglect, and we should also bear mention that this is relevant. Again, we don't have time to discuss much of this. I will just continue kind of giving a brief overview and oversimplification of the native tribes that existed in North America. We will be focusing really very much on the New England and Mid-Atlantic. Of course, there were many more. There were many more across what today is the current the United States, but the main ones in the North Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic is basically the Algic and the Iroquois nations. There were more complex societies in the south. The most complex Native American society in north of Mexico occurred more or less in the 13th, 14th century in what today is around Mississippi. And the other important societies in what today is New Mexico, if you are close to that, there are Pueblo. They are called El Pueblo because that's the name given by the Spanish. So it's a very different setting. And they relied mostly on corn. There's some agriculture, corn corn, as you may know, is kind of the prime staple in the Americas. It was originally domesticated in Mexico, and from there it kind of expanded through North America and also South America. But basically, the farther north, the harder basically the process of domestication, or the harder the process of being attached to of being a sedentary civilization. That's why most of the Algic and Iroquois tribes were kind of a mixture between nomad and sedentary. The Iroquois were a little bit more sedentary than the Algic. They were a combination of both, but nonetheless, it's kind of a different setting of what the Spanish, for example, experienced when they arrived 100 years earlier to what today is Mexico City and Lima, for example, or Cusco, sorry. So again, an oversimplification here is we have the Iroquois and the Algic nations. And let me just stress that even before the arrival of the Europeans, I want to stress again, there's a lot of political economic conflict before. Because again, there are different tribes and they are contending for resources. So the theme that we discussed in the previous lecture about social conflict still applies here. They are trying to survive, and there, of course, a scarcity of resources. Two of the main things that they were trying to contend in the Mid-Atlantic and the New England region were first the control of the St. Lawrence River. Why? Because all across time and even up to our days, basically waterways are the most cheaper or less costly ways to move goods and also yourself. So nowadays, of course, we have cars and so on, we have airplanes, but still, the main way by which we transport goods, the massive amount of goods that are moved all across the world from China to Europe to the Americas, all move through water. And that's kind of a constant all across history. And who controls the waterways basically controls the access of the resources. So that was very important. A second aspect is basically what goods were the most important. And this is something that modern people or current people, most people, of course, all of the people that I am talking to, obviously, have a trouble associating why some goods were super important in the past, because we cannot really understand the way in which life in the past occurred. Nowadays we have access to a plethora of goods that we take for granted them. So for example, one of the most important necessities across history is clothing. Nowadays, we are lucky to live in a place and in a time in which basically clothing is mostly in overabundance. Now, the problem that we have is that the clothing is so cheap that really we don't even have to take care of it. Really, if you buy it and it does not fit, you buy another one and you use it and it deteriorates. It does not matter. You keep buying, and now the problem is that we generate a lot of trash, right? Well, across history, that was not the case. Clothing was a necessity, and most people did not have access to. And this was, of course, very important in places where cold was an issue, because, of course, if you don't have an appropriate clothing to survive in cold weather, well, that basically is matter of life and death, right? And in a world in which we did not have access to artificial materials, we had to rely on what nature provided. And one of those things that we had access to is fur. So control of fur was one of the main things that actually made the colonization of basically the Great Lakes area, both by natives and later on by Europeans. A lot of one of the most important companies, the Hudson Bay Company, which was English, and the contention between Canadians, later on Canadians and Americans, and English and French before that, in the time that we are discussing, more or less takes into consideration that the fight for the resources of who controls the beavers and who controls the fur. And again, this was existed even prior to the arrival of the Europeans. Now, if of course one of the things that occur is that when we create groups because we share a language or a culture or so on, what also occurs is that you create, even though there's a lot within group cooperation, there's also conflict outside of that group. And so that is kind of the oversimplification that I'm trying to say here, is that there's a conflict more or less described between the Iroquois and the Algic nations in order to control this access to resources. And traditionally, the historiography has more or less pointed that the heuristic to understand how this contention work is that most of the time the Iroquois allied themselves first with the Dutch because the Dutch arrived to North America first, and later on with the British. While the Algonquin, the Algic tribes, more or less allied themselves with the French. So you have kind of the Native Americans using the Europeans for their own goals, and the Europeans obviously doing the same. This is not, nobody here is cooperating for the sake of cooperating or being just hugely empathetic. Everybody wants something out of the deal, and both Native Americans and Europeans are contending in the same background. This is just a picture of a community of Algic in North Carolina, where you see kind of an agricultural crop, but this mostly were later on, they could move. They were really nomadic. So I will skip this because we don't have time to discuss a lot of these issues. Just kind of a brief question that sometimes arises when we discuss this, that sometimes is neglected, but I think it is a quite relevant question, is why didn't the Native Americans end up conquering the English or the Europeans? And I'm not going to discuss what occurred in South America or in Mexico, because there the ratio between Europeans and Native Americans was overwhelmingly in favor of the natives. Even after something that occurred that helped quite a lot the European expansionism, is that when they brought diseases, there was a demographic collapse of the natives. That means that there's contention between geographers and historians about how much people died in Native Americans due to these new diseases. But we know that there were a lot all across the continent, from North America to South America. A lot of Native Americans perished. That created kind of this issue between newly arrived European settlers that are experiencing high fertility rates and are replenishing because migration, and the settlers which are experiencing a demographic collapse. In South America and Mexico, what occurred is that the rate was so large initially, the baseline was so large in favor of the Native Americans, that really the Europeans never became a majority. They were always a minority in Mexico and below. But in North America, that was not the case. So that meant that in terms of the fight for resources between Europeans and natives, basically the Europeans had an advantage. So of course we also need to stress that there was kind of an advantage in terms of military technology that the Europeans had, but it was not only that. It was in terms of numbers and in the medium run, and also given the fact that the Native Americans were experiencing this demographic collapse, they had everything to lose. Now, another important aspect in which I want to emphasize is that the way in which social conflict between Native Americans and Europeans occurred was also sometimes due to the fact that there are asymmetries of information. So one common thing that historians have discussed quite abundantly is the fact that Europeans did not know how Native American polities work, and Native Americans did not know how European polities work. So just a brief example, this is an invention I'm making of my own. So I'm an English colonial settlement, and I make a peace treaty with a band of natives. But now I expect that if you belong to an Algic nation, then as an English, I expect that I have a peace treaty with all of the Algic tribes. But that was not the case. That was a misunderstanding. If I'm an English settlement that make a peace treaty with a specific band, then that treaty only the band itself would abide by it. There may be another set, a second or third band of Algic band or tribe that actually does not have to abide by a treaty, but the English did not understand that. And so when this third or second band raided the English settlement, that caused, of course, resentment among the English colonies that thought they had a grievance. So then they raided the tribe that they knew that they signed the treaty with. And now, given that the Native Americans also knew nothing about why was this happening, they obviously believed that they had signed a peace treaty, and now they are being raided by the English. So it creates this basically feedback loop in terms of misunderstandings over misunderstandings. And this is, of course, something that can only be dealt through experience, but this, of course, contributed quite a lot for the many conflicts that originally occurred in the early contacts between English and native settlements. If you know a little bit about that, the King's Philip's War in the late 17th century between England in English and Algic tribes was mostly because of these kind of issues. Now, I don't want to spend more time than that because I already kind of talk more or less of the large points that I want to make reference to. So it's just to bear in mind that Native Americans were super relevant. Now we move on into the second point, that is what was happening in England. So now we understand what was occurring in Native Americans when the original settlers arrived, the colonists arrived, but what actually incentivized the settlers to actually migrate in the very first place to America? And we cannot understand that without attending the major political and religious issues that were occurring in England at this point in time. One of the most important things, of course, is in terms of the state of England in the context of Europe at the time. So at this point in time, England was a peripheral country in Europe. So by the later on in the 18th century, of course, it will become kind of the prime European power, especially after the French Indian War and the 7 Years' War all across the globe. Basically, it becomes the first global empire that controls all sea lanes across the world, defeats the French and the Spanish in Americas, and they defeat the French in India, and they control everything mostly. But in this point in time, that was not the case. And it had been more irrelevant a couple of 100 years earlier in times of the 100 Years' War. Remember, basically the English king had possessions in what today is southern France, but after the 100 Years' War, it lost all of those possessions. So it's a very relatively peripheral and poor country. The same is true for the rest of the British Islands, or the other parts of the British Isles, the Scotland and Ireland. And Elizabeth I dies without a heir, and the closest heir is the King of Scotland, who becomes then the King of England, James. And this is the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. And here is where we see kind of one of the biggest point of contentions is that when he becomes King of England, he kind of has an idea of how he wants to govern based on the fact that he already was governing Scotland in a given way. And that way was very different. What do I say by that? Is now we call back to the English constitutional history that you may all know, in the fact that that is highlighted in the process that led in the 11th century to the signing of Magna Carta, and the constrainment of the king versus the feudal lords, and now the rise of the parliament and the constituency and the representativeness of the parliament with respect to the king, and so on. So when James, he's King of Scotland, he's more or less an absolutist king. And I'm not oversimplifying here, but he mostly is an absolute, he has absolutist powers. But he becomes King of England, and he actually is not. He has to contend with a lot of constraints. One of the major constraints, of course, is access to resources. So the budget. The budget is constrained by the parliament in London. And a lot of the issues in terms of trying to understand how the parliament in London contests the king's power and the debate surrounding it, not only in terms of the king as an executive and the parliament in terms of who governs what, the other set of debates that will become super relevant later on for the following 100 years, that will lead eventually to the fight in the American Revolution, would be dictated in terms of debates surrounding what's the scope of power of the parliament and who dictates what's representative and what is not representative. So this is kind of some of the early debates that will resonate throughout the century. And this is again why it's important to understand that at the end of the day, the American Revolution itself was instituted, or the core fundamentals of the debate kind of transcended what was occurring in England and transcended into the establishment of the US as its own polity. And that's one big theme that we need to understand. The second aspect is just the political economy of the time. So I kind of already stressed that there is this conflict between James as king because he's constraining its budget compared to the parliament in London that basically manages the resources. But remember, this king is now also king of Scotland and Ireland. And here, what I want to emphasize is that this is not yet the United Kingdom, in which we have kind of a united parliament for the whole area. Here is we have one king, a superintendent of the realm, and we have three different kingdoms that govern very differently. That means that James had access to most of the Scottish resources because there he was not as constrained, and also he had access to a lot of the resources in Ireland because again the polity in Ireland was very different. I will not be discussing a lot of Ireland because it's a quite complex setting in itself. But what I want to stress is that there's this idea that if the king can actually fund or have alternative sources through alternative polities, he can actually have other ways to fund its own prerogatives and hence can have the power to eventually maybe overthrow the parliament in itself. So again, the fight between the parliament and the king is super relevant. And here is kind of the top-down incentive for the king to early kind of charter some of these companies that would move towards North America and settle. This is a top-down incentive. Why? It's because the king, kind of as his own power, is legitimizing the effort to settle other areas and seeing that the Spaniards are doing so well all across the Americas. They say, well, I should do it as well. But this is not an English chartering from the parliament, it's from the king. So that means that the colonies themselves would respond to the king rather than to the English parliament. And again, this is super important because when, say, the early settlers arrive in Virginia, for example, they will create Jamestown, and there the settlers will create their own colonial assemblies that were different to that of London. Again, and then you can see more or less the early contentions that are still not there, but will resonate quite a lot later on when we see who has the power to govern over the English Empire. Is it the Parliament in London, or is it the colonial assemblies in each of the colonies in North America? And now, why, going back into history, why in the 17th century the Stuart dynasty were interested in actually chartering these companies is because if they could create alternative institutions there, that actually the taxes will go directly to the pocket of the king rather than pass through the constraints that were fixed by the parliament in London. And hence, again, create contention between the king and the parliament. And hence, a lot of what would later occur also from the point of view of the English in terms of trying to limit the potential explosiveness of the American Revolution from the point of view of the parliament in London is try to limit the power of the king to actually make a coup against the parliament. So we will be talking more about that in subsequent lectures, but bear in mind that again, studying the history of England is important because this is kind of the core foundations of what was occurring. Here, of course, we have Elizabeth and James. Here we have kind of a map of the historical regions of England, Ireland, and Scotland. Again, there's not a union, there's not an act of union that will only occur in the 18th century. This is just a superintendent of realms. I'm going to skip this because I really don't have a lot of time. Perhaps just mentioning that, of course, we have in the 17th century, which was a quite conflictive period in time for English history, what you have. I already talked a lot about the resources, the contention for the resources between the king and the parliament, but also there's a bottom-up process, right? In terms of who wants to migrate. It's not only that there must be an incentive for the king to legitimize who will move, but also there must be an incentive for people that want to move to North America. And perhaps the most important example, and it's something that I already called for, are the Puritans, kind of the most salient or obvious example, mostly because, again, in the religious setting in which England was reformed against Catholicism in the 16th century, and later on there was this whole religious fight between Catholics and Protestants all across Europe. That fight also arrives into England, and the Puritans believe that the Anglican Church has not been reformed as much as they would want to, and hence they believe that they should leave because England itself is redeemable. That's kind of the first incentive of Puritans of leaving England. So they say, I don't want anything to do with what these Anglican people are doing there. I just will fund my own society. And of course, we'll be discussing more in detail this, but this creates a set of homogeneous society that will be very different from other set of colonies. Now, the early waves of migration from to New England from Puritans will be in the early stages because now what happens after the English Civil War, and there are a set of conflicts that are known as War of the Kingdoms. Within those set of conflicts, there is the English Civil War. Then we have Oliver Cromwell kind of overthrowing the Stuart dynasty and creating the Commonwealth. Now, this didn't last with Oliver Cromwell's death. Then there's a return to the Stuart dynasty, but again, there's another set of issues that lead eventually to the Glorious Revolution. But a lot of the migration of Puritans can be understood by way of looking into what was happening in England. When Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan himself, becomes the prime protector of England, of course, the incentive from Puritans to move to the North America ceases. That's why New England is one of the first places where migration actually ceases to exist. And again, this is the importance of understanding what was happening in England to understand the process of settlement in North America. There's a book here that more or less explains how the monarchy occurred. I'm gonna skip this. The Glorious Revolution is a very important event. A lot of contention in terms in the literature. There are a lot of debates about how important this was, not only for the future of England, but for the building of the state capacity that will make a century later the British the most important empire across the world, and also in terms of creating institutions that lead to modern economic growth. This is something that economic development theorists and economic historians have long debated about the importance of the Glorious Revolution. Unfortunately, of course, we don't have time to discuss it, but it is super relevant to understand not just how migration to North America occurred, but also the whole process of economic growth in the long run. Because modern economic growth starts in England, then basically moves to Northern Europe, and then to Western offshoots such as the United States. So now, another aspect that I want to highlight here is in terms of the bottom-up process that lead to the incentives to move, is that there's a whole tradition, both by geographers, cultural geographers, and historians, to kind of point the idea that even though there were a lot of migration in the 19th century in the United States, and even today, there's kind of a quite contentious debate about how much migration should be, even if it should exist in the very first place. Some of the early aspects of migration for historians are what dictate the core fundamentals of what makes the United States, or what makes the early colonies the early colonies. And here is where basically there's a heterogeneity between the cultural regions, because again, the Puritans arrive into New England, and they are very different to, say, for example, the people that arrive into Virginia. So most of the people that arrive into Virginia, for example, are people from the south of England, and are themselves perhaps Anglicans, and are mostly from an aristocratic background. They were the fifth, sixth, seventh sons of a family that had land and had power in England, but because they were the fifth, sixth, seventh, they will inherit none of it. And so if they wanted to basically continue the tradition, they had to move into North America. So again, it's very different. In New England, you have Puritans, which have a different set of values, and in Virginia, you have some sort of Anglicans that kind of the idea of the plantations that will become kind of the norm there already resonates quite a lot with them. And also we have another aspect, other colonies like the Pennsylvania. I'm in Philadelphia right now. If you have visited Pennsylvania, you know that the Philadelphia, since day one, is one of the most heterogeneous societies, contrasting with, say, New England. In New England, only if you were Puritan, you were allowed to migrate there. In Pennsylvania, given that their own efforts of William Penn, which is a Quaker, which his own religious background suggests that tolerance is super important, it accepts people that are Christian, but from a myriad set of leanings. It's not just one aspect. It's not just one Puritans. If you're Catholic, more or less. If you are a Jew, for example, or if you have other religions, you would be accepted. That creates also an incentive for a lot of people all across Europe to start migrating. For example, again, if you move to the interior of Pennsylvania, must have seen that there are people from Deutsch, from German ancestry. They were people persecuted in Europe because of their religious beliefs, and they fled and they became established here. If you are in Philadelphia again, there are some areas that have names in Welsh. There are also a lot of Dutch. New York, for example, has a large Dutch. So that's a different state, but that's kind of the scope of the Middle Colonies in general. But also in Pennsylvania, there's a Dutch heritage, and there's also a lot of Swedish heritage. So generally speaking, there's a culture that only can be explained that goes from England to North America. And also, for example, we sometimes forget that it's not only division between the colonies, but within the colonies. So there's a division between Tidewater and the backcountry, the Appalachians. The people that settle in the Appalachians are mostly people that were used to live in the borderland zones between Scotland and England. And if you know a lot about what, even if you just by actually watching Braveheart, which is kind of one specific movie that highlights the contentions between England and Scotland at the time, you know that there's a lot of issues there. And just think in terms of potential conflicts that could arise from you living in the medieval ages in places where there are border zones. So if you are an English farmer, then a Scottish raids your farm, you cannot go and complain with your local policeman. Why? Because the English policemen do not have actually any jurisdiction over Scotland, and the same occurs for the Scottish. If an English raids their own farm, they cannot do anything. So that creates an incentive for people in the borderland zones to actually do not trust the political institutions and actually create a culture of self-defense, of having guns, because they cannot rely on the local institutions. And a lot of those people actually migrate to the Appalachians. So I'm not trying to say that a lot of the gun culture that is quite interesting and is perhaps unique about the United States comes from just from this, but there's a lot of literature stressing that a lot of it does come from that aspect. A lot of the people that inhabit the Appalachians are specifically people that whose ancestry comes from the borderland zones of England and Scotland. And again, this is just kind of a story to tell the idea that it is super important to understand the process of early settlement that creates the core foundations. Even though there were other migration waves in the history of the United States, most famously Irish and Italian, they had more or less to adapt. And this is what is called, by Wilbur Zelinsky, a cultural geographer, the doctrine of first effective settlement, which kind of frames the idea that these early settlements were the ones responsible to create the foundational institutions, and later arrivals had to assimilate, and there's a path dependence from them upon the rest. So there are a couple of books here. One of the most famous ones that actually goes more in depth. There are 1,000 pages in this book called Albion Seed. Again, it highlights the point that in order to understand the history of the United States, both political, cultural, and economic, you need to understand where did the original settlers that arrived into North America came from. This is a map of where the regions in England and where they established themselves in North America. And just bear in mind, that is something that also Professor Jesus mentioned in passing, is that a lot of the people that arrive in North America actually would want to move to Caribbean, because the Caribbean is the zone where you would be rich. This is the place where actually the large plantations that will make you rich exist. I will explain more about that in just a moment. Perhaps one of the core aspects, and here is the economic aspect of the geography of the United States, is that the whole commonality is that there's a lot of land, and because there's a lot of land, because there's a ratio, there's not enough labor. And so that creates some of the initial incentives for many of these different societies, given the initial set of cultural conditioning that they already have, how they will adapt to that setting. either through early on indenture servitude. What is indenture servitude? It's mostly the fact that imagine that you are Englishmen in the 17th century and you want to move, migrate to North America. Of course, you cannot pay that. But what you do is basically say, I will not pay that. But if you lend me funds, I actually work for you for a couple of years. That is indenture servitude. And that's, of course, some sort of coercive labor. Later on, of course, there will be some rebellions, especially as Professor Sean highlighted a little bit with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in the late 17th century, that created the necessity for non-English to actually to actually work. And that is where the emphasis to actually import labor and the institution of slavery that came from Africa. We will be talking more about slavery and its relevance in the development of early economy in the next week. And of course, also family labor, because unlike modern economies, basically, if you have a son, once you are of age, and when I say you are of age, is that you are 6 years old or something like that. You need to start working because living in the pre-modern world, it's harsh. So everybody has to contribute. So but land has always been kind of the promise, and that's again why after the French Indian War ended and the promise to move to the West failed because it was constrained by the British Crown, created some of the early conflicts. Uh, I'm gonna skip this for just a moment. Skip this. It's just a farm in Pennsylvania. I'm gonna skip this and just move in the last 20 minutes that we have to discuss the third aspect, which is an overview of the description of the regional economies of colonial America, and why we say that there's colonies is because we really need to contend with the fact that there was not a unified market. What it existed is a set of different colonies, different regions that had their own markets and that, they, of course, also have their cultural backgrounds. This more or less correlates to what I've just been saying about different colonies coming from different places in England, contending with different set of endowments. Again, moving into Virginia is very different to moving to New England. Moving to New England means that you move, and you've been to New England, is not a place that you will actually have a lot of fertility in your lands. There's not a lot of crops. It's a barren place. So in order to adapt to survive in New England is very different to what you need to do in Virginia. In Virginia, in fact, if you look into the map, there's a lot of rivers. And of course, what we already know is that the soil is very good for the plantation of tobacco. Tobacco is a very good demanded commodity across Europe. So, and you come from an aristocratic environment that favors already land holding, so you became a planter. The plantation of tobacco also favors some sort of mid economies of scale. So there's an incentive for you to create a plantation. And also, more importantly, there are a lot of rivers. So what means is that you have your own plantation, you have your own dockyard in your plantation in the river, and then you move directly your tobacco producing your own plantation from your plantation to Scotland, to Glasgow, or to England. You don't need to have a trading entrepot. You don't need to have a unified port. Unlike what would occur in New England. In New England, well, the land is barren, as I was telling you, but then there's a need to actually find a city where people will trade. They will specialize, for example, in the production of whaling, which in that time was very important as a source of energy, kind of before oil was relevant, of course, and also fishing. The fishing industry would be relevant, and both whaling and fishing will be tied with the Caribbean islands. Why? We will be discussing in just a moment, but the very fact is that the Caribbean colonies would be the ones that would be over specialized or only specialized in the production of sugar. So tobacco is a very well demanded commodity, but not like sugar. Sugar really is the main commodity that will drive the incentive, the economic interest of the people at the time. And what that means is that if you live in an English or Spanish or French Caribbean island, the economic incentive is for you to just devote time into basically producing sugar. What that means is that you have to import everything else. Even if you use, as you did, most of the labor that you had was coerced labor, it was through slavery, you still have to feed that people. And you do not produce the food that is required to feed that people. So you need to import it. Where do you import it? You import mostly calories and from meat, from New England. The lower south, the Carolinas, will produce a lot of rice that will also go into feeding the labor use. So that's kind of the network, the trade network connection that made these economies possible. But they were different. There was not a whole unified economy. It's not like the same. There were a lot of non-tradables, if we are kind of in economic jargon speaking here. But they were in a trading setting where there was a network that we unified, but this connection between, which you may be familiar, in which the oversimplification of Europe, England produces the capital goods. It is within the context of Africa that creates, has access to the labor, and the context of America is that is the land. It's kind of the trading connection there. And this is why, I guess, even though we say that there's not a unified US economy or English economy in this point of time, there are three commonalities, and every region is very different, again, both culturally, in terms of the endowments geography that they face and the incentives they face. There's a lot of difference there, but nonetheless, there's some sort of commonalities that make all of these regions share some patterns of growth. And those patterns are, again, the one that I've already discussed, which is the centrality of trade. Everybody depended very much on trade because no region, even though, say, for example, Pennsylvania is one of the most self-sufficient regions because it produces a lot of wheat, and it also produces some sort of meat for their own consumption, and it also produces some capital goods. Still, it was not self-sufficient. And of course, the Virginia economy and the Caribbean economies were not self-sufficient by themselves. Everybody had to connect. So there was a centrality of trade. And because of that, one of the other aspects that we highlight is that they experience extremely fast population growth. And I already kind of anticipated this when I said that the French did not experience this. But this, from a very small amount of settlers, they moved just because migration kept coming, but most importantly, because the fertility rates increased quite a lot. Not only compared to other societies in North America, but most importantly, compared to societies in Europe. A lot of children were produced in this time, and through basically, if you know the power of percentages, through time, if you're having a lot of children, eventually you will have a lot of people. And not only that, is that you're also enjoying a lot of unusual prosperity. And even though the data is kind of scarce here because we don't have a lot of information to make inferences about it, we more or less can attest that by this point in time, in terms of per capita measurements, we can say that English colonies were among the richest per capita across the world. Perhaps the only other society was as comparable rich was another set of a small society in another republic in the Netherlands. But besides that, we can also kind of say that, again, in per capita terms, the English colonists, on average, were actually richer than the average person living in England. So I'm going to skip a lot of this, but I want to emphasize this data. So the other slides, you can look more into basically some estimations about the rates of per capita. But given that those data are quite contentious because we need a lot of assumptions, one of the other ways that we can infer kind of welfare is just look into wealth. So this kind of just a picture, and it presents a picture that paints the net worth per free person at the time on the eve of independence, on the time in which the American Revolution occurred. And more or less, what I want to stress here is the level of difference between not only within the colonies, but between the North American colonies and the Caribbean. So even though the tobacco economy were of course much more richer than the colonies in the north, which actually had worse endowments, nonetheless, the difference here is not as large as between Jamaica and the Upper South. Because again, even though tobacco was a well-demanded commodity, it was not as well-demanded as really as sugar. And really, we can say, and we will see in just a moment, that really the most extractive economy of all, the one that relied mostly on slave labor, in which really the migration did not exist, and really the ratio between slaves and non-slave was the highest, was basically the Caribbean. And this kind of had an effect in terms of the set of institutions that they would create and replicate throughout the centuries in these particular regions. So just think in terms of what are your incentives as an elite in the Caribbean to actually invest in public goods. Most likely, if you own a plantation in the Caribbean and you are rich not only in terms of North America, you are rich in terms of the whole world. You are among the richest persons. Most likely, you don't live in the Caribbean. You own the plantation and you may stay in the Caribbean a couple of months per year, but you are part of the English elite. Your mansion is really in London. This is not true for the Virginians. So the Virginian elite, they are rich, they own plantations and they export tobacco, but they are part of the North American economy or the North American region. They are not rich compared to the English rich. They are not at the top of the hierarchy there. So they would invest a little bit more. And of course, if you go into New England, again, I remind you, this is a very homogeneous society in New England, in which there is not a unified commodity that they can extract resources from. So, in order to cooperate and actually allocate resources to improve the welfare, they have to cooperate quite closely. That's why also they constrain who comes into that society. That's why only Puritans are allowed, because those are the ones that the rest of the society acknowledge that they will work hard in order to produce, and there will not be any free rider, and hence all of the incentives for them to invest, say, in public schooling, which is one of the most important aspects that we tend to think when we think about institutions in the colonial times, and when we think about what are the most important universities in the world today. Of course, we think, say, Yale and Harvard, and there's a tradition that goes way back from the times of settlement, because of the whole set of institutions kind of coincided and created the incentives to create that sort of development path, which again is very different to what occurs in the lower south, and of course is also very different to what occurs in the Caribbean. And here the middle colonies are kind of in the middle ground as well. So I guess that is relevant. I don't have time to cover more a lot of this, but a lot of the prosperity is due to the fact, of course, of the trade. It's also because of the improvement in terms of trade. What do I mean by that? Is even though there's an improvement in terms of how much the colonies are producing, whatever they are producing, really at the same time that that is occurring, the industrial revolution is also occurring in England. What that means is that, and given that England is specialized in production of capital goods, it becomes quite good at that. What that means is that whatever you are buying clothes, that you say you produce a ton of tobacco, and that in 1 year gives you a ton of clothes. But given that the productivity in England is rising so fast, your own productivity may rising, but not as fast. What that means is that through time, you end up having access to more consumption goods through time, because a lot of capital and consumer goods that require capital goods are being produced in England. So all of these three kind of get together and give us the result that there was a lot of welfare in the North American economies. There are other ways to measure, not only through kind of assessments of economic means, but only through height. Like if you are actually eating better because you have more access to resources, then you will actually increase your height, literacy rate, and so on and so on. I will not go skip this. So in terms of population dynamics, as I was telling you, there's a natural evolution in terms of the explosiveness that we perceive. And here again, I want you to look into the contrast between the North American colonies and the Caribbean, which I think is super relevant. So at the very beginning, again, as we saw in the early map, when I showed you that most people wanted to migrate to the Caribbean because that's where people saw that the rich plantations were, what you see is that after more than 100 years, there's a degree of explosion in terms of white population arriving from Europe, but also this is kind of obviously there's a mixture between new migration waves, but also in terms of the fertility rate. Both of them occurred at different, there's a lot of variation within the colonies. There's also, of course, an increase in terms of slavery or in terms of coerced labor that is brought from Africa. Yes, that is true. It's mostly localized, of course, in the southern colonies, that actually their institutions are suited to that aspect compared to the North Atlantic and Mid Atlantic colonies. But again, What I want you to see here is that the difference between the Caribbean and the North American colonies. Here, the white European population kind of stagnates. It's kind of the same in 1650 compared to in the 1770s. And the amount of basically slave population that lives throughout this time is increased as much as in North America. Again, the difference is that the total amount of population is not comparable. This is a slave society. This is a society that really seeks for the extractiveness of one resource, which is sugar, that will be consumed in Europe. And slavery is brought precisely because it's kind of the factor of production that you need to do that. While in New England, you don't need that because you don't have any good that is so well demanded. You create another set of institutions. And again, what I want to stress is that not only look into this type of outcome, but also look in terms of the other things that I have said and how they compound each other in order to produce different outcomes. These kind of graphs that explain more or less the same, and they also kind of affect the incentives to create cities. Again, what I was telling you is that there is no incentive for the Virginia plantation to have any kind of city because they transport their own tobacco good directly from their plantation to Europe. But there are incentives for Pennsylvanians and Middle Atlantic colonies and New England to actually have cities. That's why there is no major city in the South. The Charleston is the largest one, but it's really minor compared to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is the city. That's why everything okay. This is where a lot of the political aspects occur. This is why this kind of the origins of the American Revolution. Everybody reunited in Philadelphia. Skip this. Explains a little bit more about migration versus fertility rates. I already talked a lot about trade, so I'm gonna skip this. I guess I don't have a lot of time, so let me just go into the conclusions here. Each set of these slides more or less talk a little bit about the differences in terms of population, in terms of trade, in terms of prosperity of each of these regions, which again, I already highlighted kind of the most important aspects. But if you want to know more of the specifics, go look into the specific slides. I just want to end by kind of creating the summary that I think more or less compounds the whole story for you to grasp. And this again goes back to the introduction. What are we explaining? We need to understand what are the set of initial conditions that create the feasible institutions, that create kind of the feasible policies, that create the allocations, that actually give us a given specific outcome. And if we were to focus this through 4 regions, what we have, for example, is New England, again, is in the north. There's a barren pieces of land, no commodity to extract. There's no staple commodity. They were inhabited early on by Puritans, a very homogeneous community. It creates institutions that favor kind of cooperation because everybody works hard and disincentivize people free riding. As you have to be Puritan to live here. And if you're Puritan, you work hard because this will benefit you. But if you're not Puritan, you are not accepted. So of course you can be ostracized here. And that of course gives a place to some sort of public policies that give emphasis in kind of investing in a lot of this. I already kind of talked about public schools, but also in terms of security and so on. And it creates a society that even in our days has a low level of inequality. And then let's contrast this with another set of examples as the Upper South. Again, here the early inhabitants were people that came from an Anglican aristocratic background. So they were used to actually live by the idea that land holding was very important. And they arrived into an area that it was very prone to produce tobacco. So they specialized and produce this very well regarded crop. That creates an emphasis in they are still English, so as Sean Gelmar emphasized, they are still have an emphasis on the importance of representation. But who belongs to that representation? That's the difference. So here in New England, everybody, if you're a Puritan, you have a voice and more or less a vote. Well, it's not entirely as that, but there was more equality of voice and vote. In Virginia, that is not the case. You have to have land. You have to actually be as someone. And then that will be your representativeness. And that leaves some sort of policies that will be very different. There's no incentive to actually produce public schools. Because again, if you are a rich plantation owner, you can actually hire your own your own teacher to teach your own son. So you don't need the public school. So that creates obviously conditions that will evolve through time and create more levels of inequality. And then to contrast, well, the middle colonies, as I was telling you, Pennsylvania, kind of the prime example, more heterogeneous. It accepts more settlers from different backgrounds. Again, it's very different from Puritans. The mechanism of organization of the Puritans is that we don't accept anybody that is different. That is how we assure that everybody cooperates. But from Pennsylvania's, they accept a lot of people, but they accept so a lot of minorities that no minority ends up dominating each other. But because of that, they need to create assemblies that actually create constitutions, their local constitutions that allow for some sort of relevance to each minority. And that creates some policies that are even more open to migration and creates also contribute wealth and have inequality, but not as large inequality as that in the South. And with that, I think we can say that it's enough for the kind of understanding, kind of the necessary things to later address what was the prelude to the American Revolution in the 18th century. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Fernando. So we've got some questions here. We're about to start the Q&A, so if you'd like to ask a question, please send it now. I'll try to combine some of these. So we'll start with a more broad one. You've talked about a little bit about these divergences in regions and how different factor accumulations lead to different growth trajectories. So I guess the broad question is just, does any of this still matter today? Is there really, this still kind of this deep roots divide, it seems, between South and New England and that kind of stuff? And, just do these differences matter for today?
Well, I would say yeah, totally. I mean, obviously there's a debate about how much they matter, but if it is true, as Wilbur Zelinsky emphasized through the doctrine of fair settlement, then they totally matter for the creation of set of institutions. And there are some sort of outcomes that we can measure even today. The one that I've already mentioned is in terms of inequality. Again, if you look into inequality today by whatever measure do you want to look at, there's less inequality in New England compared to inequality in other parts of America, especially the South. So yes, I would say that for a lot of these things, they still resonate through time. So obviously we can contend that obviously history is not predetermination. There are some sort of set of policies that actually can address some of other issues that have occurred throughout history and can change the policies. But nonetheless, the starting ground matters in order to understand the process of differentiation between the United States, between the regions of the United States.
All right. So the second one, this is a few, so we'll combine them here. The profitability of the Caribbean colonies, specifically the British ones, suggests that Britain's wealth accumulation during this period stemmed largely from slavery and the slave trade. Would you agree, slash, is this a correct interpretation?
So no, I would disagree. I mean, I'm not trying to say that, and this is something that I may have forgotten to say, but I'm not trying to say that slavery, I'm not trying to condone slavery in any way or means, but I don't think that slavery itself explains the economic growth of either the colonies or the English colonials or England itself. And again, I think Professor Jesus already kind of discussed this because we have a counterfactual. And the counterfactual is the fact that Brazil, even though the English were very rich, if we contrast who controlled the Caribbean and who controlled the real market of sugar, it was not really the English. It was really first the Portuguese and a lot of French, the French authorities, IT. I mean, the level of exploitation that the French did in IT is much, much larger than that of the English. Now, to say there's also a huge discussion I think we will discuss in just in next lecture about the role of slavery and who profits from that slavery. And if you look just in terms of an easy supply and demand table, in terms of if I use slavery as coerced labor, and again, I'm not condoning the use of slavery. I'm just saying that slavery exists as a way for labor to actually be used in the production of this commodity, which is sugar. Now, the thing is that sugar, you want to sell it to Europe. What ends up occurring is that it creates an excedent that is appropriated by the consumer. And I think a lot of people would agree, a lot of economic students will agree with my assessment. The idea is that the real people that benefited the most from the slavery, they are not the English plantation owners, but the European consumers where the sugar was actually consumed. Mostly because, I mean, I'm not trying to say that the English plantation owners were not rich. I'm telling you, they were very rich, but it was kind of the market rate. It was not above market rate. It was just kind of the rate kind of dissipated because more sugar than perhaps would have been created absent slave labor.
All right, great. So we got this next one here. During the presentation, it seems to be implied that property rights were intrinsic to only the European colonists, and Native Americans would not contest that. There might be a lot of questioning by the Native Americans to land seizures without compensation. Can you briefly explain how colonists imposed their property rights on other groups?
So, I mean, this is a very broad question that obviously resonates not only in the colonial times, but also throughout the 19th century in terms of how Native Americans and Europeans and later Americans or people from the United States dealt with the problem of basically who owns the land. And yes, I'm not trying to say that they were, technically speaking, they were conquering. Yeah, the Europeans conquered just as some Native Americans conquered. There were some kind of regulation. There were some treaties, and again, this is where I emphasize that there were a lot of misconceptions about how do the Europeans make treaties and they understand the treaties with the English settlers and how the asymmetry of information lead eventually to even more social conflict. And it also very much depends in terms of the French versus English. Like if you were a native that were allied with the British, and basically they if you were helped, then that will mean that you will actually enjoy some benefits out of that. But if you lost, then obviously you will not benefit from that. Now, having said that, of course, as I already told early on, one of the big issues, salient issues in terms of that will lead to the American Revolution is that after winning the French and Indian War, the American colonies, well, the English colonies that will become the Americans, would want to expand more and more to the west. And that means, of course, seizing land that was not really them. So seizing by force. So yes, I'm not trying to say there was no appropriations, but here the conflict was not just between the colonists and the Native Americans, but also most importantly, perhaps, is between the British Crown and the English colonies themselves. Because again, who bore the cost of waging a war against the natives was not really only the English settler, but was mostly the crown itself that had to pay for the security of this area. So again, this is a quite complex. I don't have time. I didn't have time to cover a lot of these issues, and honestly, it needs to be discussed in a case by case scenario because I was saying it's not the same to deal with the Algic tribes compared to the Iroquois tribes, and of course there are many other tribes, and there's a lot of within variation within each specific tribe. So depending on each scenario, there were transgressions. Of course, there were violations of property rights in terms of who owned what, and the right of conquest definitely occurred. If you lost the war, basically your land was seized. I mean, and this is more or less what occurred in when you see a lot of Native Americans actually were that supported the British against the revolutionaries, and a lot of these people eventually fled the United States. And some of the, if you know a lot of some of Canada, they call Native Americans the First Nations. Some of the First Nations that are the earliest ones to be recognized are really Native Americans that fled after losing them after they losing after the Americans won the American Revolution, and because of that they abandoned their land and were given land in English in English North America, which became Canada.
Great. So this one kind of ties into one of your earlier answers where we're talking about how things were maybe a bit more in the Spanish colonies and kind of this different French America as well compared to the English. Can you say anything about maybe why these British colonies may have outgrown these Spanish and French? And was this, something to do with institutions where they were settling? Just kind of a broad answer.
Well, yeah, I think I skip over that, but the main thing is that again, the English settlers enjoyed a quite tight connection with the rest of the empire. It had a large trade network again that made them quite prone to new migration waves, especially in the south. And not only that, they had a different set of cultures because a lot of these people also were fleeing England culture that had their own incentives to actually have larger set of families. This is kind of the same time that some famous novellas like Jane Austen and things like that will kind of tell the story about many women in Europe not having any prospects and basically not marrying and ended up without children. So basically, there's a demographic shift in Europe that really does not happen in Americas. And that again, that creates incentives for this demographic explosiveness. And again, one of the issues with the French, if we are contrasting the French and the British, is the fact that there was a quite tight control about who migrated from France to the French areas. That means that you have to be loyal, you have to be Catholic, you have to follow a lot of strict things, unlike what occurred here in English North America, in which, again, if you're Puritan, you can flee, you can go to New England. You can go to, even if you are not English, you can go to Pennsylvania, and so on and so on. So that creates a different sort of incentives. And of course, also, the French in North America arrive more to the north, so they arrive even later to the stage. So the prime state of the Americas were already occupied by the Spanish, and then the English, and then the French. Now, if we contrast the Spanish with the English, it's a different story because again, we are talking a very different setting. But I don't want to go in depth about why the Spanish did not experience the demographic explosiveness in its own area, but they definitely didn't as much as the English.
Right. Yeah. So we're almost out of time, but this is a follow-up question if you can get through it. This is in terms of the conflict between the indigenous and the English colonialist. It seems to be that this clash between different sets of property rights, collectivist, more private, seem to be resolved mostly by sheer military force. Does this seem to be the case? Is this a correct interpretation?
So I would say, I mean, yes, when there's a lot of social conflict and there's a lot of asymmetry of information, as some of the themes that we have discussed, sometimes you rely on violence, and the one that wins kind of that game is the one that ends up kind of pushing their own agenda and winning how the resources are allocated. Sometimes violence is unstable in the medium run. Sometimes it just kind of protects the resources of one sector against the other. But yeah, that's kind of the question, the $1 million question by economists or people that are interested in understanding how the people cooperate. And it has nothing to do just with Native Americans against Europeans. Again, the conquest has occurred for all human society. What's different nowadays is that now we have built institutions that actually allowed us to resolve our conflicts without an open call to violence. But yeah, there's this kind of the escape route that you always use when you cannot get what you want.
All right, great. So looks like that's the end of the questions, and we are actually out of time. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Our next guest is the same time, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursday. So thank you everybody. And thank you, Fernando, for presenting.
Thank you.